Hi friends, it's me, Em again, and welcome back to my channel where we talk about all things sinister. If you are interested in true crime or if you like all things horror related, make sure you hit that like and subscribe button. That way you can join me for some morbid conversation. Now today's story is going to be taking us abroad, and that's because we are going to be going to the UK to talk about the Saturday Night Strangler, who would later be identified as Joseph Kappen. Kappen would have run-ins with the law starting at a very young age, his first offenses being around 12 years old. He would end up being in and out of prison for most of his young adult life for anything from burglary, assault, and car theft. Kappen first got married when he was in his mid-20s in the year 1964 to Christine Powell. Less than 2 weeks later, Kappen would have another one of his stints in prison for burglary. During his marriage with Christine, he would assault her regularly, and because of those assaults, she would end up having 2 children with him, a daughter and a son. Now, obviously, Kappen is not a great husband here, and to make matters worse, while he was married with Christine, he would regularly try to pick up underage teenage girls. And when they would resist his flirtations, he would often try to force himself on them. Now, some of those girls did get away, but unfortunately, a lot of those advances did end up going unreported. It wasn't until the early 70s that Kappen would actually begin to escalate. His first known victim would be Sandra Newton, who was only 16 years old. She attempted to hitchhike from a nightclub on July 14th, 1973, when she would end up being abducted by Kappen. She would be sexually assaulted before being strangled with her own skirt and dumped with no attempt to hide her body. 2 months after the death of Sandra, Kappen would strike again, taking 2 girls at one time. It was September 16th, 1973, when Geraldine Hughes and Pauline Floyd would also attempt to hitchhike home from a nightclub, and their bodies would be found the next day, also assaulted and also strangled. By this point, the police were beginning to warn the community to avoid hitchhiking, as this was the common link between the murders. They also had around 150 detectives working on the case. One of the biggest leads that they had in the murders of the 2 recent young girls was the fact that Geraldine and Pauline were spotted getting into a white Austin 1100. Now, police would use this information to try to narrow down the suspect list, but even knowing the type of vehicle that they were looking for, it still left a little over 10,000 potential drivers that they would have to speak with. Now, one of those drivers who owned that kind of vehicle was Kappen, and police actually did end up going to his house to speak with him about that night. When they got there, his vehicle was up on blocks and the wheels were removed, and Kappen had told him that the car was not in drivable condition. Not only that, his wife Christine, who had been dealing with Kappen's abuse, also lied for him and made a fake alibi for him. So this combination of things, the police just went on to the next person on their list, and they didn't really look more into Kappen there at that time. Now, unfortunately, a few days later, Kappen would end up being pulled over by a different police officer for kind of like a stop and check procedure. And it was noted that Joseph Kappen was driving the kind of car that they were looking into. However, this was the 1970s and the early 1970s. All this was done pencil to paper. They didn't have a digital system like we have today, and there was no way to quickly cross-reference any of these police reports. And so what I mean by that, the police officer who pulled him over had no idea that he had just recently lied to the police about his vehicle and his wife giving a fake alibi for that night. So he didn't look any more suspicious than any other guy driving that type of car. You see what I mean? So again, he basically just slipped through the cracks there. Now, during this time, Britain was kind of in a rough state. They were dealing with a really hard economic situation for the time. They were dealing with certain energy and power struggles at the time, and they just really didn't have the resources and manpower to keep pumping into this case. And so by 1974, the case had basically been put on a shelf and they weren't really intensely working it anymore. They didn't close the case, but they couldn't continue to pour more resources into the case. So the case kind of went cold there for a while. By 1990, the case remained cold, but by that point, Dr. Colin Dark had turned his eyes toward the evidence and thankfully had the forethought to do something that would end up breaking the case decades later. He had said regarding the evidence, "Luckily, I anticipated the sort of developments that might happen in DNA research and asked for the girls' underwear to be stored in our labs at Chepstow. The key to cold case work is having material left to work with, you see." So this is what they did. They kept the girls' underwear stored in a safe area to preserve the DNA that was left on them. And Dr. Dark ended up being right. As we know, so much advancements have been made in DNA technology. And in the year 1998, a huge breakthrough in DNA happened. And what they were able to do was separate the DNA between the victim and the killer and isolate the killer's DNA. Now, by the year 2000, they were able to take that DNA of the killer and put it into the database. And they were able to search the database. And if anybody arrested after 1995, when they started cataloging this DNA, matched the DNA from this crime, it would hit when they put the DNA into the search engine. So that's what they did. They took this DNA, they put it in the search engine, they searched, and nothing came up. Kappen's DNA was not in the database because he had not been arrested and had his DNA sample taken from him anytime after 1995. However, now that they did have his DNA, something that they didn't previously have when the case was originated in the early 70s, because remember, it wasn't isolated at the time, this was enough to get the case officially reopened. And this time they'd have new eyes on the case. Detective Paul Bethel, Phil Reese, and Garrett Bale would end up taking on the case. And the trio would end up going through the old evidence where there were 35,000 potential suspects. They would end up enlisting the help of psychological profilers, kind of like what you see on Criminal Minds, where they would narrow that down to 500 potential men. They would take this list of 500 and they would start swabbing people. Just swabbing to see if they could find somebody whose DNA would end up matching the DNA that they have on file. Now, they would end up swabbing 353 potential suspects and not getting anywhere before they would end up at Joseph Kappen's house. And when they got there, Christine answered the door and she informed police that Joseph had died 12 years previous because of lung cancer. So he was no longer alive. He was no longer there. They obviously couldn't get his DNA. However, when police were looking into the cold case and they were looking into the files of these men, Joseph Kappen really just jumped out at them. Looking at his file, he was in trouble a lot as a young adult. He was always in and out of prison. He was a troublemaker, and something in their gut just told them to continue to look on and see if this is their guy. Even though he's dead, something just told them to follow your gut, follow your instincts on this one. So they took the DNA that they had on hand, that they had isolated from the girl's underwear. And this time, when they ran it through the system, instead of running it through as an exact match, they ran it through to see if they could find any familial matches, like, a relative, a brother, a sister, a daughter, a son, anybody who was related to this DNA, if any of those people had been arrested and put into the system after 1995. And when they did this, one match ended up coming, and that was for Paul Kappen, Joseph's son, who had been arrested multiple times for car theft. Now, when they had this information regarding Paul, they would end up going back to Christine, and they would speak with Christine and her daughter and see if they could get their DNA as well. And when they did, they also put that together in the lab, and they had the full family's DNA. So they know that Paul's DNA came from Christine as well as Joseph. And then their daughter, who I couldn't find her name, but their daughter came back as also sharing a familial DNA with the killer's DNA. So they can say with confidence that Joseph Kappen was the Saturday Night Strangler. They were so certain of this that they would apply to exhume his body, and they were granted the ability to exhume his body. And when they did, they took samples from his teeth and from his femur, and to nobody's surprise, 100% exact match on the DNA from the girl's underwear. So without a doubt, police were certain that Joseph Kappen was the Saturday Night Strangler. They had ended up closing this cold case decades after it happened, using DNA that they had the forethought to preserve, knowing they didn't have the technology to look into it at that time, but knowing that it was possible that they could have that technology in the future. So there are a couple things that make this case so interesting. One, this is not only the first time in the UK, but the first time in the world that familial DNA was used to identify a serial killer after their death. Two, it is the first time that a serial killer has been exhumed to prove their guilt. But then third, this is the first documented serial killer in Wales. So it kind of had a trifecta of interesting things about this case, and yet I haven't really seen a lot covered on this particular case, which is why we're going into it today. Now, the unfortunate thing about this case is Kappen was suspected of committing other crimes, and he was even suspected of committing other murders. But unfortunately, the DNA in those cases didn't exist or wasn't preserved in the matter that the DNA on this case was. And obviously, he's dead now, so it's not like he's going to be able to confess or have any kind of epiphany of, come to Jesus moment where he lays out his crimes to us and lets us know what he done. So there are going to be cold cases that are either unsolved or just unproven, and we can just kind of suspect it was him, but we have no way of proving it because this happened in the 1970s. So that really sucks that some people are not going to get that closure on their case because it's just been too long and the guy's dead. What's really cool about this case, though, and it really makes you appreciate the science that we have in the true crime and in the criminal justice community. I have always said I'm a woman of science. I think science is so cool. It's one of my favorite parts about these cases. Oftentimes, it is the key to solving a lot of these cold cases. And it just amazes me that we are able to take DNA from the 1970s and use it to solve a crime decades later. That blows my mind, and it will never not blow my mind. I think that is hands down one of the coolest things about fighting crime. I mean, really, that's what you're doing. It sucks that he was never brought to justice in the sense that he got to live his life and die of, I mean, he died of lung cancer, but die of natural causes rather than having his day in court. That really sucks. But at least there's a little bit of peace knowing that it was him, and the families can have that kind of closure knowing who it was who committed those crimes. But yeah, I am a true crime junkie at heart, but I am also a science nerd. And I think using science to solve cases like this is just cool as can be to me. I love seeing a cold case solved even if it's decades later. To me, that's almost cooler that evidence is able to be held onto for literally decades and then science comes in and saves the day. And if you think that's cool, if this is the kind of stuff you're into, like I say, make sure you're subscribed to the channel because I am always looking for new and interesting things like this to talk about. And if that's the kind of stuff you'd like to talk about too, I'd love to have you here. Make sure you're subscribed, like the videos. If you want to be notified the next time I post a new video, make sure you turn on that post notification bell and YouTube will send you a notification right to your phone to let you know the next time my videos pop up ready to view. All right. Until that next time, though, friends, as I always say, take care, stay safe, and I'll talk to you later. All right. Bye.